Germany as a hostage of Russia and, by extension, the rest of the European Union in thrall to Moscow. Germany needs gas, Russia has it in abundance, and there's a pipeline being built between the two. Natural, neighbourly dependence, or the potential for blackmail. Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin have something of an odd couple relationship. She speaks fluent Russian, he speaks fluent German, but there's always been a certain cool distance between them. But as Germany's reliance on Russian energy looks likely to increase, we ask on this programme whether Berlin, and thus the European Union, is becoming something of a captive to the Kremlin. Recent months have seen Russia's pariah status harden in the UK and the US. But Germany continues to enjoy close, and some would say cosy, relations with Moscow. At a recent NATO summit, Donald Trump said that Germany is controlled by Russia. Is this an exaggeration, or does it bear some truth? And as Germany becomes more reliant on Russian energy, is it becoming the Kremlin's captive? Early September 2018, and workers begin laying pipes for Nord Stream 2. The massive project will deliver natural gas from Ust-Luga in Russia to northern Germany. It is the second phase of Nord Stream. The first phase started pumping gas in late 2011. The security implications for Europe rankled Trump. He tweeted, "What good is NATO if Germany is paying Russia billions of dollars for gas and energy?" Germany is Europe's industrial powerhouse, but it has to import more than 90% of its natural gas, and more than half of that comes from Russia. Fears persist the Kremlin could turn off the gas as a diplomatic weapon, as it did with Ukraine in 2014.
The idea of Nord Stream 2 is the way to nowhere. The way to nowhere in the sense of energy security of the European Union.
NATO recently highlighted how Russia may use energy supplies in its, quote, hybrid warfare. The links between Russian energy interests and the German political class are high level. Straight out of office, Merkel's predecessor Gerhard Schröder took a top job with Nord Stream. He's now chairman of Rosneft, Russia's state-owned energy giant.
Aus ökonomischen wie politischen Gründen, dass es nicht vernünftig ist, unseren größten Nachbarn Russland ökonomisch und politisch zu isolieren.
But the mood in Berlin may be changing. The new Foreign Minister Heiko Maas has called Russia's recent actions hostile and antagonistic. He was criticized by all German parties, underscoring how close relations have been with Moscow. So, has Germany been naive? Or have certain NATO countries been looking for motives where none exist? The last decade has seen Germany come out as the European Union's top player and power broker. Its relations with Moscow pose major questions for the rest of the Union. And I'm very pleased to say that joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C., we have Sir Peter Torry, former British ambassador to Germany. In Vilnius, in Lithuania, Dr. Margarita Seselgyte, Associate Professor in International Relations, with me at the Roundtable. James Rogers, Director of the Global Britain Programme at the Henry Jackson Society here in London, and Marko, Gasic, International Affairs Analyst. Thank you all very much indeed. So, Peter, let me come to you first of all. A captive to the Kremlin. What do you make of that?
Oh, I think that's completely over the top. I mean, I think the Germans do have a closer relationship with the Russians than others, and I think in many ways that's probably no bad thing. I mean, it's good, even though Russia is in the sort of control of the regime that it is now, to keep talking to them. But I think you need to keep in mind that Merkel, all right, she speaks Russian, but why does she speak Russian? Because she grew up in the Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. She knows what the Russians are like. Why does Putin speak German? Because he was head of the KGB in Dresden. That is not forgotten. And I think in Merkel, you have somebody who sups with a very long spoon when it comes to dealing with the Russians.
Is this what they refer to as Putin verstehe? The Germans get him. They understand what makes him tick. And thereby they will stay on the right side of him? Or perhaps it indicates too much proximity?
No, I think that the Germans have always tried to keep a relationship with the Russians going. And that goes back to Bismarck, at least to Bismarck. And it was the renunciation of that treaty with Russia, casual renunciation, that was one of the important steps in the drift towards war in 1914. More recently, Ostpolitik has been, you could argue, I think, a very sensible move by the then German Social Democratic government, opposed at the time by many of its NATO allies as naive and misguided, but with the benefit of hindsight, really quite sensible. I'm not here to to excuse the Germans. I'm not German. I'm British, and I have my own views about the current regime in Russia. But I think that it's probably no bad thing that you do have a sensible relationship, or at least the ability to talk between Berlin and Moscow. And don't forget, when you're talking about Nord Stream 2, the Russians need to sell their gas. Throughout the Cold War, they were exporting gas to Western Europe. They never, as far as I know, turned the taps off then. If it's in German interest to import cheap Russian gas, it's certainly very much in the Russian interest to export their gas, because they need the foreign exchange. And I think it would be a massive own goal on their part if they were to start using gas as a political weapon.
Okay, well, that's where you're coming from at the moment. James from the Henry Jackson Society here. Peter's saying, look, it isn't likely to happen because it's in both countries' interest to keep the business going. But what if it did happen? And you can come back on this in a moment, Marko, and Margarita as well. But what would happen if one day they just turned the tap off?
Well, it would have quite profound implications for European security, but it would also potentially have implications for them as well, because they would no longer become a trusted supplier. But I think if I can extend a bit, that it's a bit broader than just turning off the energy taps, because insofar as Germany is one of the largest procurers of Russian oil and gas, this means that revenue is pouring into Moscow's coffers, which in turn allows Moscow to engage in its revisionist foreign policy in Ukraine and more broadly across the Euro-Atlantic region, against countries like the UK, against the US, and of course against the countries on the eastern flank of NATO, the smaller countries like the Baltic states and countries beyond NATO like Ukraine and countries in the Caucasus.
Okay, so we now should examine why Ukraine in particular and other countries are particularly upset about this. Actually, let me come to you first of all, Marko, before we go into that. Two of our guests saying that it's not going to happen. It's in nobody's interest to turn these taps off. What do you think? Because this is something that has been put there.
Well, I think there is zero chance of the taps being turned off, because from Russia's point of view, that would be financially idiotic.
They've done it before.
Only in the context of a supplier who's not been paid by his customer, not for any political reasons to do with geopolitics. I mean, the point is here that they want a stable customer. They want to send a message to their customer base that they can rely on Russia. And as Sir Peter said, they've had decades of an entirely different confrontational political system vis-a-vis the West,
so what's going on with
which they did not switch anything off.
Okay, what's going on with so many people saying this is a dangerous move?
From what point of view?
And a lot of people saying that signing this deal with Russia and allowing Russia, effectively, I think somebody said, to have their foot on the throat of the European Union, that it is a dangerous move. So why do you think people are saying that? If it's so obviously to you is nothing of the sort.
I do think they're trying to ratchet up the feelings towards Russia. because it does serve a vested interest within our own societies. There's a lot of people who benefit from increased defence and military spending within our societies, and they're the ones who are really going to be looking for the perpetual enemy. And they've focused now on Russia, but I don't think it's appropriate, because at the end of the day, the defence spending of Russia, the military spending of Russia, is a tiny fraction of what we in the West spend on exactly the same cause.
So, Margarita, the suggestion is that it's scaremongering. From where you sit, what do you make of that?
I could see at least three possible challenges that implementation of Nord Stream could have for Europe, and for in particular those countries, small countries in the region that Russia is sort of acting aggressively towards these countries. So first of the challenge is that we still remember how Russia is using energy tools, trying to meddle in the country's political systems. And Baltic countries have suffered from this meddling not once. I remember in 1990s, when we declared our independence, Russia has cut
when you say we, you mean Lithuania? Yep.
Lithuania, exactly. Oil supply for 2 months as a punishment for a very courageous decision at that time. In 1993, Estonia were taking a law on the citizenship, which was not very favorable vis-a-vis Russian-speaking minority who would not wanted to apply for the citizenship.
So rather than doing a long list, may I just ask you this? Marko in the studio suggested excuse me, Marko in the studio suggested that the reason why supplies were turned off was simply because a customer wasn't paying the supplier.
Well, those countries were paying. Probably Russia was portraying the situation as not enough money being paid, and you have to bear in mind that after our independence, we were paying the highest prices in Europe for the Russian gas. So there was money which had been paid. But if you are very interdependent on the Russian energy resources, you are becoming vulnerable. Probably Russia would not use the same tactics on Germany, because Germany is too big customer, and therefore they would sort of have some challenges themselves. However, this vulnerability still remains. Another important point that I want to bring up is the European unity, which is a very important thing, trying to fight against Russian aggressive tactics in the region, trying to fight against Russian hybrid strategies. And Nord Stream has a big effect on the European unity, because there are a number of countries which are not satisfied with the further implementation of the project as well. This project undermines European Union third energy package, and also the goal of the European Union for diversification of energy sources, trying to diminish the dependency on Russia.
Okay, Margarita. So Peter, you're sitting the interview for the position of German ambassador once again, and somebody says to you, please explain, Peter, because it wasn't Sir Peter until a little bit later, please explain, Peter, how German egocentricity in this could affect the unity of the larger European project.
Well, I think this is not an uncontroversial project in Germany itself. I mean, there are plenty of critics of it, precisely for the reasons that others have so eloquently spelt out. There are concerns about over-dependence on Russia. I think what the Germans would say in response is, firstly, the main concern, as I understand it, from countries like Poland and Ukraine, is the risk that gas could continue to be supplied to Germany direct, bypassing Poland and Ukraine, and that pressure could be put on those two countries or other countries in the eastern part of the European Union, because the Germans themselves would continue to be supplied.
And is this because
all I can say on that is
sorry, is this simply because they're missing out a bit of the old pipeline?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, because it's pipeline from Russia to Germany, it would no longer bypass Ukraine as the current pipelines do. That would deprive Ukraine both of access to gas and, of course, of access to the foreign exchange that the transit fees earns them. All I can say to that is that Merkel has made very clear that she will do her utmost to ensure that Ukraine receives compensation, at least financial compensation. And they have also said that because more gas is coming through this pipeline than Germany actually needs, they would be prepared to export some to the other Eastern Europeans if that were to be
What about
necessary.
countries such as Denmark, who don't like the idea of this? They're upset as well?
I don't think you could really say that the Germans are. One of the other concerns of mine is Brexit, and there the German position is entirely predicated on maintaining the unity of the European project. I mean, there is one sort of core anchor in German foreign policy since the war. Well, there are two. One is the NATO alliance, and the other one is the European Union. And their major concern on Brexit is that we are undermining the unity of Europe. I think that the Germans will be very concerned, or will certainly keep a very wary eye out on anything that undermines the unity of Europe. And I hear what our Lithuanian colleague has said, and I think that is clearly something that should be addressed.
Can I bring it back to the studio for a moment? So why NATO's big concerns? If Merkel is so aware of the sensitivities, James, of dealing with NATO when it comes to Russia, why NATO's major concerns with something that Germany says is in its best interest and no problem for NATO?
Well, it's a sort of joke a bit. It seems a bit like it's a strategy of Germany first. So on the issue of Brexit, let's say, or other issues, when Germany is opposed to those, Germany states that it dislikes them and brings up the issue of European unity. But then on other issues where Germany is to gain or to benefit, such as the Nord Stream pipelines, Germany suddenly says that this is in our interest and it's in everyone's interest.
So why NATO's concerned?
Well, NATO should be worried because, as I said before, every time we buy gas and oil from Russia, and these primary products account for around 50% of the Russian economy, or Russia's ability to sell things overseas, its exports, these account for a sizable amount. So every time that Germany buys gas and oil from Russia, it makes Russia richer. Russia, therefore, then has additional revenue to pour into its instruments of power, which in turn allows it to meddle in countries on the eastern flank.
So are you saying that President Trump has rightful concerns, or is he simply, as we're laying out the economic argument here, trying to sell something that's more expensive, his gas, liquefied natural gas, instead of the Russians, which is a cheaper form of simple natural gas? So he's trying to say it's bad because he wants to get his product on the market.
Well, undoubtedly there is an element of the economic to it, the argument, but nevertheless it depends on trust. Who do we trust more? Do we trust the Americans, who have helped to undergird European security for the past 70 years, or do we trust Russia, which is currently engaged in a war in Ukraine
and you, Marko.
Affecting security across the whole of the region?
Should we distrust them both?
I think that would probably be quite sensible, because then we might come to a rational decision looking at what they can both contribute to our standard of living and indeed our safety in all respects. But I think we should bear in mind that without Russia as the chosen enemy, the other to be feared, there really is no case for NATO existing at all. So it will be necessary for NATO to have its antithesis to warn us all against in order for it to exist itself. And I would say also that NATO's intention, and perhaps the US's more specifically, is to create, as opposed to a Berlin Wall, we could have a Kievan ditch, something to separate Europe from Russia, force it into the embrace, the rather more expensive embrace of its American, well-heeled American partner, and therefore achieve two things at once: be able to have a customer for the US LNG, which, as we said, is rather more expensive, and at the same time to isolate and weaken its chosen military opponent in the East, that is Russia itself. So what I'm saying is these warnings are really strategies for developing a NATO role in the world, which I personally find quite...
Margarita, I will come to you in just a second, but I think James wants to get in on something that's just been said to my left, and then we'll come to you and Sir Peter.
then to Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I don't think we should go into the spheres of influence thinking all of the countries in Eastern Europe that are a part of NATO and some beyond them wanted to be part of both NATO and the European Union. And why did they want that? I'm sure, as Margarita will say, it's because they are fearful of what Russia will do to them. And the evidence shows that Russia will invade and occupy and annex countries if it is given the chance to do so.
No, not at this particular moment. Margarita, let me come to you. Petro Poroshenko, Ukrainian president, says this is not a commercial project. Well, that's, I think to a large extent what we've been hearing that it is. It is not economical or profitable. It is absolutely geopolitical.
I think that, you know, every country has an opinion of what this project means to them. So some countries would say that this project would allow to increase the consumption of Russian gas and would bring more money to the Russian defense budget. Another argument comes from Ukraine, for instance. Having an alternative pipeline will make Ukraine more vulnerable against Russian probably attacks in terms of trying to cut the gas which flows through the Ukrainian pipeline.
But other than looking at history, what leads you to think this is going to happen again?
Well, because previously it's been done in 2005, 2009. But then the consequences for Europe, where the gas was going, were quite terrible. So Russia was thinking about their, first of all, profits and the political consequences. When there is an alternative pipeline, Russia would not have much considerations if it wants to punish Ukraine. Therefore, Ukraine feels more vulnerable if there is an alternative pipeline. Plus, we already discussed about this. It also cuts the profit that Ukrainians were having through the tariffs imposed for the transit through the pipeline in Ukraine.
Let's go to Washington, D.C., Margarita, if I may, and ask Sir Peter, as and when the gas starts to flow, is there anything we should look to see that it isn't quite what it seemed to be?
I think we should assume that it will continue to flow because it's clearly in the Russian interest that this should continue because they need the money. Now, let me just come to the point that was made. Well, they're using the money to finance foreign policies with which we are unhappy. There may be something to that. The trouble is the facts of life are such that many of our gas suppliers are countries that, you know, on that logic, we shouldn't be importing oil and gas from Saudi Arabia because it's using money to finance a war in Yemen, which we disapprove of. We shouldn't be importing gas from all sorts of places.
Can I put it a slightly different way?
Let me just come back to one point, which is I don't think you should regard the Germans as unduly naive. This is a country that for 50 plus years half of it was occupied by the Soviet forces. They know what the Russians are like. They know what they're dealing with. You have a chancellor in Merkel who has grown up in the Soviet bloc. They're not under any illusions. And I think that, and look at what they have been doing. They have been in the forefront of the EU reaction to imposing sanctions on Russia following the annexation of Ukraine. They are leading the Minsk process. They stood foursquare behind us following the Salisbury poisonings. They're not naive.
Okay, I will rephrase the question probably slightly better than the way I put it to you, I hope, Sir Peter, to my guests at the table, which is bringing in sanctions here. The Americans turn up the ratchet on Russia, and in doing so say to European companies, you will not do business. Those European companies are involved in doing business, part of which is the pipeline. So there's a confrontation there between the Americans on one side and the European Union to some extent on the other. Is that a potential for a flashpoint?
Well, it's a potential for rivalry within NATO or within the West.
Yes.
But nevertheless, sometimes some things are legitimate. And to become more dependent on Russia's gas and oil supplies, I think is a profound strategic mistake for Europe, and particularly for Germany, and particularly for Eastern Europe.
You've got to get your gas from somewhere.
Well, you have, but you should diversify, or you should try to diversify your energy composition. And Germany, to its credit, has tried to do this. It has increased the amount of renewables, for example. But it's also done very silly things. For example, after the tsunami hit Japan, Germany closed down or decided to close down many of its nuclear power stations. Now, tsunamis do not hit Germany, and Germany is in a relatively calm area, so there's no reason to do that. It doesn't make any sense.
That sort of makes some sense, doesn't it? It was a knee-jerk reaction to sort of populist views about nuclear power.
Well, they had a regional election in Baden-Württemberg where the CDU was afraid of losing.
We'll save that for another programme, Sir Peter, if we may, 'cause we've got about a minute and a half to go.
I wanted to say, well, with this American position, Europe needs to make up its mind what is in its best interest. And it strikes me that Germany, as a major customer of Russia, a society which wants stability, energy security is the base of stability. Russia also wants stability because it doesn't like being totally isolated over there on the edge of Europe. Now, if Germany is the main customer in Europe for Russian gas, then Germany can distribute to other parts of Europe as the major solid supplier, as it were, on behalf of Europe, and therefore guarantee Ukraine a supply that it might be afraid of losing from direct supply going from Russia itself. So I think this is a good and stable solution for all of Europe, and if the Americans don't like it, well, they should ask themselves why.
Yeah, so effectively Germany becomes the European gas hub.
Why not?
For the rest of Europe, and the rest of Europe's worried that something could go wrong, either in the delivery of it or in the geopolitics of which Germany's part. That is another programme also.
Indeed.
Yeah. OK, well, thank you very much indeed, Sir Peter Torry, Margarita, James and Marko. Appreciate it. We've got plenty out of this, and we've got plenty more to chew over in weeks to come. Whether we actually concentrate, Sir Peter, on that German election is another matter, but we understand the implications of what you're doing and the fact that it's 7 o'clock in the morning in Washington, D.C., and it is very hot in October. We appreciate the fact you got up. Thank you for coming on the programme. Thank you, Margarita. Thank you for watching, and we hope to have your company next time. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team, goodbye for now.